Ever ponder why a whole culture might seem to lose its sense of reality at times? Why do obviously illogical people start adopting irrational beliefs in large numbers? Collective psychosis is a frightening phenomena that has long captivated historians and intellectuals. The famous psychologist Gustave once said, "The masses never thirst for truth. They turn away from evidence that doesn't suit their tastes, preferring to deify error if it seduces them." I want to start with this before we go any farther. It is easy for whoever gives them delusions to become their ruler. Their victim is always the one who attempts to shatter their delusions. This startling finding makes us consider how a civilization might descend into insanity. Now, if I were to ask you to name the biggest hazards to civilization, you might name wars, pandemics, or natural disasters. What if I told you, however, that Carl Jung believed that the human mind itself posed the worst threat? According to Jung, the biggest threat to civilization is our incapacity to address the inner forces of the psyche. It's a battle against our own nature, he said. Is the Latin saying, homo homini lupus est familiar to you? The wolf of man is man. This expression perfectly expresses what Jung intended. In the worst periods of history, when the illogical becomes the norm rather than the exception, this wolfish tendency is most apparent. This phenomena was dubbed a psychological plague by Jung. He penned the symbolic life. Man is the greatest threat to humanity, not starvation, earthquakes, viruses, or disease, for the straightforward reason that there is little defense against psychological epidemics, which are far more destructive than the most severe natural disasters. What is a collective psychosis, though? In short, it's a sort of lunacy epidemic that throws a whole civilization into a state of delirium and detachment from reality. Although this may seem unrealistic, there are many real-life, unsettling occurrences throughout history. Consider the 16th and 17th century witch hunts that swept over Europe and America. Thousands of people, primarily women, were hunted and slaughtered because they were used as scapegoats by a scared society rather than because they had committed any real crimes. Francis Hill discloses in his book, Satan's Delusion, that when the craze subsided, almost no women remained alive in certain Swiss communities. The 20th century totalitarianism is another notable example. Millions of people adopted beliefs that now appear to be blatantly harmful and irrational. But at the time, these concepts captivated entire countries. The consequences of a mass psychosis are absolutely disastrous. When a society descends into madness, its citizens experience a moral and spiritual regression, according to Jung's extensive research on these phenomena. They grow increasingly emotional, illogical, and careless. In a crowd, people do crimes they would never do on their own without regret. Even more terrifying is the fact that a society in collective psychosis is unable to recognize its own insanity, just as a person in psychosis is unable to identify their illusions. For those who live with this illness, there is no outside perspective to gauge the scope of the issue. However, what triggers a collective insanity in a society? In order to respond to this, we must first comprehend the reasons behind an individual's psychosis. The emphasis here is on psychological causes, while physical trauma and substance abuse can also be triggers for crazy. The most frequent cause is a surge of unpleasant feelings, like anxiety or terror, which plunges the person into a panic attack. When we are in a panic, we frantically look for help. Can you imagine this panic spreading like a virus throughout the entire population? While some choose to face the cause of their worry, others choose to escape by having a psychotic episode. Contrary to popular assumption, a psychotic break is a rearrangement of the individual's experiential reality rather than a plunge into disorder. It blends truth with illusion, fact, and fiction in a way that lessens panic attacks. Although it is dysfunctional, it is a coping technique. One of the foremost experts on schizophrenia of the 20th century, Silvano Ariete, described the psychogenic phases that result in insanity. The first stage is the panic attack, during which the person starts to see things differently. They are scared, seem perplexed, and can't explain the weird things that are happening to them. What Arendt refers to as the psychotic insight phase comes next. The person starts to organize their perceptions throughout this period, developing a pathological perspective on the world. They are able to justify their strange encounters in this way. Though it is psychotic since it is founded on delusions rather than a true knowledge of the circumstance, Arendt refers to it as insight because the patient at last finds meaning in their experiences. Essentially, delusions enable the person experiencing panic to escape the barrage of bad feelings, but at the expense of losing their sense of reality. According to Arendt, a psychotic episode can be viewed as an aberrant method of managing a severe anxiety episode. Now take that and apply it to a whole society. A collective psychosis can happen when a group of weak people are frightened into panic by actual, perceived, or made-up threats, just as a flood of negative emotions can cause a psychotic episode in a sensitive person. Here's the intriguing part, though. Madness can appear in innumerable ways, and delusions can take many different forms. The historical and cultural background of the impacted society will determine the precise shape that a collective psychosis takes. Totalitarianism is currently one of the most dangerous types of collective psychosis. Totalitarianism, according to historian Arthur Vers-Lewis, is the contemporary occurrence of completely concentrated state power, coupled with the denial of individual human rights. Society is split into two categories under totalitarian regimes: the governed and the rulers. Both groups have a pathological transformation. Our nature as flawed humans who are readily corrupted by power stands in stark contrast to the ruler's almost divine status. However, the masses are relegated to the condition of dependence of these pathological rulers, becoming infantile and psychologically regressive. One of the most prominent 20th century totalitarian scholars, Hannah Arendt, characterizes this as an effort to change human nature itself. However, this change does not bring about a utopia. It transforms sound minds into diseased ones. Delusions are what create and maintain the societal change that occurs under dictatorship. In his book, The Rape of the Mind, psychiatrist Gustave outlined how menticide, or the murder of the mind, is a key component of totalitarianism's success. According to Merleau, menticide is a systematic technique of psychological manipulation that obliterates people's capacity for autonomous thought, allowing the ruling class to ingrain its own opportunistic ideas into the minds of those it intends to exploit and eradicate. He clarified that the strategy entails using misinformation and sporadic terror to control the populace. Let's now examine the progression of this menticide process. It starts with the installation of dread, which causes panic in the populace and primes them to hold on to delusions. The usage of dread waves is one method that works quite well. With this approach, there are intervals of tremendous panic and quiet, but each calm is followed by a time of even greater terror, and so on. Merleau describes the psychological effects that every panic wave produces. Because people are still affected by the prior event, its effects are easier to produce after a breathing space than they were before. With every new propaganda campaign, morality declines further and the psychological impacts intensify, reaching a public that is already at a low level. Propaganda is essential to the process by which fear primes a populace for menticide. The masses' brains are destroyed when propaganda is used to disseminate false information and foster misunderstanding regarding the nature of the issue and the source of the threats. People are unable to think coherently due to contradicting stories and purposefully confusing information. This method works especially well because, as Merleau pointed out, logic may be challenged by logic, but illogic perplexes those who are attempting to think rationally. In addition to immobilizing the logical intellect, this intentional misunderstanding makes the populace more reliant on leaders who assert that they know everything. To put it another way, confusion makes a population more vulnerable to the illusions of tyranny. More emotionally appealing than reason and logic are the grand deception and the repetitive repeating of absurdity. The totalitarians can hit the populace with a second deception while they are still trying to come up with a plausible counter-argument to the first. There has never been a more successful way to drive society into the madness of tyranny in our contemporary environment. Propaganda and terror may spread quickly throughout the world because, to social networks, algorithms, and digital technologies, people's susceptibility is increased by their reliance on these technology and the absence of areas for introspection and discussion. In his own words, Merleau eloquently encapsulated the perils of this modernity. Man is taught to take the world he observes for granted by modern technologies. He doesn't pause to think things through. He is lured in by technology by being thrown into its wheels and movements without any time for relaxation, meditation, introspection, or dialogue. The sensory organs are constantly inundated with inputs. Man has lost the ability to question his surroundings. The screen provides him with pre-made responses. Another effective strategy is social seclusion. Isolation is a crucial component of totalitarianism's success, according to Arendt and Merleau. If you're enjoying this analysis, I want to know what you think. How do you think we can protect ourselves against the manipulations and dangers of totalitarianism in our society? Leave your answer in the comments. I'd love to know your point of view. And of course, don't forget to like this video to help bring this reflection to more people. A person is far more prone to delusions when they are alone and don't have regular interactions with friends, family, and coworkers for a number of reasons. First of all, they get disconnected from the reviving power of positive models. The schemes of the ruling class do not deceive everyone. People who are able to see through propaganda can assist others in escaping mental assault. However, the impact of these positive experiences is significantly reduced if seclusion is enforced. The fact that humans, like many other species, are more readily conditioned to adopt new thought and behavior patterns while separated is another factor contributing to the efficacy of menticide. Merleau discusses this in light of behavior research by physiologist Ivan Pavlov. Another important finding in Pavlov's conditioning theory: developing the conditioned reflex would be easier in a calm lab setting with few distracting inputs. Every animal trainer has first-hand knowledge of this. To tame wild animals, stimuli must be isolated and patiently repeated. Totalitarians have adhered to this guideline because they are aware that keeping their political victims isolated, alone, bewildered, and beaten by waves of dread will help them become conditioned more quickly. When a population is attacked by menticide, they become weak and despondent. Once rational minds are transformed into a platform for irrational forces by the constant barrage of propaganda, which causes chaos both inside and outside of them. Future totalitarians can make the decision at this stage, since the masses want for a return to a more orderly world. In a world that appears to be swiftly going in the other direction, they can provide a means of escape and a return to order. However, there is a cost to all of this. The governing class must gain authority over all facets of life, and the masses must cede their freedom. They must become obedient and subservient subjects and give up their capacity to be independent, self-sufficient people in charge of their own life. Stated differently, the general populace must succumb to the delusions of totalitarian madness. Merleau paints a dramatic picture of this plunge. The 20th century's totalitarian regimes are an example of a form of mass insanity. Reason and basic human decency are rendered impossible in such a system, whether gradually or abruptly. Only a pervasive sense of fear and the imagined enemy's presence among us are present. Consequently, the ruling class incites society to revolt against itself, yet the totalitarian world's promised order is a diseased one. Totalitarianism destroys the innovation that propels society ahead and the spontaneity that produces many of life's pleasures by enforcing rigid conformity and blind obedience from the populace. Stunting, destruction, and mass mortality result from the complete control of this type of government, regardless of its name, whether it is run by a dictator, scientists, doctors, politicians, or bureaucrats. Therefore, avoiding tyranny is arguably the most crucial question facing the globe now. Is it feasible to undo the effects of inducing a society into the initial phases of this mass psychosis? There are efforts that can be taken to help find a cure for collective madness, even though we can never be sure of the prognosis. However, this endeavor calls for a wide range of methods and individuals. The counteroffensive must be as multifaceted as the mental attack. Carl Jung asserts that the first step for those of us who want to contribute to the restoration of sanity in an insane world is to organize our own thoughts and lead lives that motivate others to do the same. It is understandable why our generation longs for the redeeming personality, the one who can free himself from the clutches of collective psychosis and save at least his own soul, to serve as a ray of hope for others, announcing that at least one man has succeeded in escaping the deadly identification with the collective psyche. However, if a person is not suffering from psychosis, there are other actions that can be performed. First and foremost, material that refutes the propaganda must be disseminated as widely as feasible. Potential totalitarian leaders' success rests in part on their capacity to restrict the free exchange of ideas. But the truth is stronger than the lies and fiction they spread. Using comedy and mockery to undermine the legitimacy of the ruling class is another strategy. According to Mirlu, we must learn to use mockery as a weapon against the demagogue and the aspiring tyrants among us. The demagogue himself is nearly incapable of comedy of any type, and he will start to lose his mind if we make fun of him. Building what he refers to as parallel institutions is one strategy advocated by Václav Havel, a political rebel under the Soviet communist dictatorship who went on to become president of Czechoslovakia. Any kind of institution, business, organization, technology, or creative endeavor that is ethically independent of a totalitarian society, yet physically located within it, is considered to have a parallel structure. Havel noted that these parallel systems worked better than political action to thwart authoritarianism in communist Czechoslovakia. In addition, a second culture or parallel civilization emerges on its own when enough of these parallel institutions are established, serving as a haven of liberty and reason in a totalitarian society, as Havel explains in his book, The Power of the Weak. If not a place where a separate life, one that is in line with its own objectives and is designed accordingly, can be lived, what are parallel structures? If not the attempts of a segment of society to drastically disassociate itself from the totalitarian system by purging itself of the self-sustaining elements of totalitarianism, what are those initial attempts at social self-organization? Above all, however, the activity of as many people as possible is required to keep from going completely into the craziness of dictatorship. An active and concerted effort must be made to return the world to freedom, just as the ruling class does not sit passively by, but instead takes intentional measures to expand its authority. As Thomas Paine noted during another dark era in history, tyranny like hell is not easily defeated, but we have this comfort: the more difficult the conflict, the more glorious the victory. This can be a huge challenge in a world falling prey to the illusions of totalitarianism. It's critical to keep in mind that the struggle against totalitarianism involves psychological as well as political and physical aspects. The ruling class is aware of this, which is why it places a strong emphasis on influencing public opinion and controlling the narrative. We must recognize our own psychological weaknesses and seek to fortify our minds against manipulation in order to counteract this. Education, not only formal education, but also self-education, is one approach to do this. We need to enhance our critical thinking abilities, learn to challenge authority, and become adept at spotting manipulation and propaganda when we see it. This entails being aware of logical fallacies, being able to verify information, and retaining a healthy degree of skepticism without being paranoid. Preserving our humanity and interpersonal relationships is another essential component. Dehumanization and isolation are key components of totalitarian regimes. We oppose the totalitarian mentality by cultivating real human ties, exercising empathy, and refusing to view people as enemies or abstract concepts. We also need to be on guard to safeguard our privacy and individual freedom. The development of technology makes it simpler for the ruling class to keep an eye on and manage the populace. We can make it more difficult for possible totalitarians to control us by being conscious of our digital habits, embracing privacy-preserving tools, and avoiding the temptation to compromise our privacy for convenience. Supporting and defending freedom of the press and of expression is also essential. In a totalitarian power grab, these are frequently the initial casualties. Maintaining a free society depends on protecting the right to express oneself, regardless of whether we agree with what is being said. Supporting alternative media and independent journalism that contradicts the government narrative is part of this. We also need to be aware of the rise of authoritarianism. It is rare for totalitarianism to emerge suddenly. Usually it creeps in little by little, with each little step less scandalous than the one before it. Even if an infringement on our freedom is justified as being for our own benefit, we must be prepared to define boundaries and refuse to allow it to continue. It is important to note that culture and the arts are important in this conflict. Because they understand how inspiring and unifying art can be, totalitarian governments frequently want to censor and stifle creativity. We may contribute to sustaining the flame of freedom even during difficult times by producing and promoting art that honors individuality, freedom, and human dignity. In conclusion, one of the most important conflicts of our day is the struggle against the widespread insanity of totalitarianism. It is a struggle waged not only on the streets or in the corridors of power, but also in each person's heart and mind. There is hope as long as there are people who respect freedom, think critically, and remain human in the face of forces that dehumanize others. The journey is rarely simple, and the result is never assured. The philosopher Albert Camus once said, "Being completely free is the only way to deal with an unfree environment, making your very being an act of revolt." Then let us pledge ourselves to this liberation uprising. Let's be the ray of reason in a world that is getting more and more crazy. As always, it is up to each of us to decide whether to support freedom and human dignity or to give in to the madness of tyranny. If you've made it this far, I hope you've taken something valuable away from this content. Fighting for freedom and human dignity is a commitment for all of us, and sharing ideas like these is an important step. So if you liked it, please like it, because it really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And take the opportunity to share this video with someone who needs to reflect on what we've discussed here. Let's spread this learning together.